So for part two of this week, we're going to go ahead and start kind of fleshing out some of our components that we're going to need for this implementation. So we've started out in our last video by setting up the week 4 DB context. So we have teachers and courses. We did students, a couple weeks ago. So the last thing that we also need is public DB set, and this will be our course selector item. These will be selector items. Will be our property name. We can always change that up if it starts to get a little confusing, but that'll be a good starting point. So this basically, if you remember what this does, is that each one of these properties becomes our mapper between our class and our table. And within our class, we have our annotation that says this is the table that this class maps to. So we have those in place. The next thing that we're going to need to do is we've got our schedule repository interface created. We'll need to go ahead and actually create that repository. So we'll go add on the models repository folder, do add class, and we'll call this our schedule repository. And this repository will implement iSchedule repository out of that week 4 module interfaces namespace. So now we have these 3 methods stubbed out. Now these methods are pretty simple to implement. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to actually first create an instance of our DB context. So we'll say week 4 DB context, and we'll call this underscore context. And then we'll create a constructor. Inside of there, we'll say new context. So that's simple enough. And then we're going to really just return context dot courses. And by doing that, that will just return all the courses. We do the same thing for context dot subjects. And we don't have a method or a property for subjects. So we'll have to implement that in our week 4 DB context. And then we'll also have to implement a couple more methods, I think, to our interface. So we need a method for getting course requests and removing course requests. So let me jump back here to our repository interface, and then we'll add a IEnumerable course request item, or course selector item. And this will be get course selectors, and then we'll pass in here a student, and then we'll have another method that is void remove course request. That'll be student, or actually we'll just pass in the course selector item. That way we don't have to juggle too many things. Just kind of clean that up. Alright. Now in our context we need to add something for subjects. So we'll just add another public DB set for subject, and we'll call it subjects. Easy enough. Alright, so this is our interface again for iSchedule repository. We'll need to implement the rest of this interface now. So we've got get courses, get subject, and then we'll get course selector. So we'll return context, and we'll do selector items. And then to add a request, what we're going to need is we're going to have to create a new course selector item, CS item equals new item. And the CS item has a few properties. It has a student and a course property. So the student will equal stu, and the CS item.course will equal course. And then our context will say selector items.add CS item. And that's really all there is to it. What we'll do is we'll return the course selector item because we may need it later, and add will return an item as well, so we'll just say return off of this call. Now the remove, it's not too much more sophisticated, but it takes a little bit more finagling. So what we'll do here is we'll say context.selector. Oh, you know what? My apologies. One more thing up here and add course request. So let's say CS item equals that, and then we actually have to call save changes. Context save changes. And then we can return CS item. So make sure you call save changes. That obviously gets me from time to time. I will always do my adds, but I always neglect to call save changes on the context so that the change actually commits to the database. All right, so back to remove course request. So context dot selector items dot remove, and then we can just pass in that item, and then same thing, context dot save changes. So this is a pretty solid implementation of our schedule repository. One thing that we do need to take into consideration is that we're passing course and student here, which is perfectly fine for functionalities, but what we need to do is make sure that our mappings in our classes are correct. Now to do that, we need to pull up our student, we're going to pull up our course, and then we're actually going to pull up the course selector item class as well. Now we need to be able to tell Entity Framework, this is a foreign key, this is the foreign key field, this is a primary key, and this is the primary key field. Now to do that, we can simply come into our students, and we have an ID field for the student, and we'll just put key. And under system.componentmodels.data annotation, we'll bring in that, and then that says that this property ID is the key property for this table. We'll do the same thing for course. We don't have a property for ID, so we'll create a property event ID, and we'll add that key attribute as well. Now, when we get into the course selector item, things get a little different. What we have to do is we actually have to go to the property that we're looking at, and then we have to add an attribute that points to the foreign key field in our table. So inside of student course request, we have student underscore ID. That's the foreign key field for this student. So this is student underscore ID. Same goes true for course. So this will be course underscore ID. And all that does is it helps the Entity Framework to understand the relationships that exist in our code. It goes through and does the rest of the heavy lifting of saying, okay, let me go get that course, let me go get that student and bring it into this object. But being able to at least identify those as being the foreign keys is really kind of the meat of making all of this work. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this course selector. We may end up not needing that class once we get deeper into the mechanics of everything, but that was just kind of part of the brainstorming process from week 5. Alright, so we have our courses, students classes, we've set up all of our classes. We've got at least a good stubbing of our repository in place. We may need to make some modifications, but we're off to a good start right there. And I think that will give us a good stepping off point for our controller. So within our controller, we have these methods of get subjects, get all courses by subject ID, add request, and remove request. So get subjects is pretty simple. It's basically going to grab all of the subjects as defined in the database and return them. Now, under the subjects table, we currently are blank. So first thing we need to do is probably stub out these subjects. So we'll do English, math, science, and social studies. 2 more things that we'll need to do is under the courses table. Let's open up that table definition. We don't actually have a field for subject yet. So we'll do subject underscore ID. That'll be an int that is non-nullable. Actually, we'll leave it as nullable for a moment. We'll update the table to add the field to the table. And then we're going to have to go through and set it. If we make it non-nullable and then try to update, it'll fail because obviously it's not defined currently, so it will be null upon creation. Alright, so we have English, so those are all 1s. Math is all 2s. Science is all 3s. And social study is all 4s. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there we go. All right. So that updates our courses table. We'll right click, oh, actually we're right here. So we'll uncheck that box now. We'll do another update. We'll update the database, and that will make that field non-nullable. So just so we have data integrity in our database schema. All right, so we have our subjects defined. So now it's simply a matter of creating a repository instance. So we'll say iSchedule repository. Do our include, and we'll call this the Sched repo. I always like to create a constructor to initialize these. So we'll say repository engine. Say get repository for iSchedule repository. So that'll get our scheduling repository for us. So now get subjects is simply schedrepo.get subjects. This will be our var of subjects. And then we're going to return view subjects. Now, the subjects list is going to be kind of a step-in point or a filtering point for what we're doing. So I don't know if we're going to be returning a view or a partial view. We'll work out the mechanics of that as we kind of work through building out our index view in greater detail. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and leave this as view, but we may end up having to go back and changing it to a partial view. Get all courses. This will be kind of along the same line, so we'll say var courses equals schedule repo get courses, and then we'll return view courses. Get all courses with a subject ID will be almost identical, except for we're going to do a where, and we'll say where the course dot subject. And we didn't actually extend our class for course to include a subject. So we'll go back to course, and we'll just add a new property of subject, and we'll call it subject as well. And then we'll add the foreign key for subject underscore ID. And just to be sure, hit F12 on subject. I'm going to say this is the key. Make sure we get all those I's dotted and T's crossed. So when you're setting up those, they're called navigation properties, where you have one class that has a property that navigates to another class. You want to make sure that you have all of that kind of lined up and matching with keys and foreign keys. That can often, kind of bite you as you're going through there, and you'll end up with weird exceptions until you get all of that straightened out, because the Unity framework tries to do a good job of making best guess, but it's not 100%. So helping it through that work is very, it's helpful, obviously, and it helps just making sure that your code is running effectively. All right, so where the course.subject.id equals our subject ID. So that'll limit the number of courses we get down to just that subject, and then again we'll just return courses for now. Now, adding a request, this is where things get a little interesting. So if you look at the schedule repo, add course request, it wants a student and a course. So how do we go about getting both of those? So what I like to do is I say, okay, we need a student. We'll call it stu. We need a course, and we'll call it course. So these are our variables. So then we're going to do a fetch on course, a fetch on student, add to repo. So the end goal here is we're going to pass stu and course, and that should give us our new request. Now to get the course, it's basically what we've been doing here. So we're going to say course equals schedrepo get courses, where we can say first or default, where c.id equals course ID. Now we're passing an int here, but we also have a course ID property that is a string, so those can become a little ambiguous. I just want to clarify that. What I'm expecting here is the ID of the course, the integer version. That's why I'm expecting an int. If that becomes cumbersome or difficult, sometimes having more specific naming is good, but as long as you're following a convention that you're comfortable with, generally you're in pretty good shape. So that'll get us our course. To get our student, we're going to have to go through a few things. We're going to have to get user, or get the logged in user, and get student by username. This will come from the student repo. So we'll have to create another repo, iStudent repository, stu repo, to initialize that, so that we can get both schedule and student data now. And then from here, the first thing we'll want is var student, or logged in stu, and this will come from user.identity.name. So that'll give us the username of our user, and if you remember, our usernames are email addresses. So we'll grab that user's email address, and then we'll say stu equals studentrepo.get, and we're going to get all students. And then we're going to do the first or default again, where that student's email address equals logged in stu. So that will get us our student, and then we'll say if the course is null, we'll throw a new application exception, invalid course ID. We'll say if stu is null, throw a new application exception, invalid student ID. So that will handle our request, and then we'll just return view for now, because frankly I'm not sure if we're going to need to return much of anything from here. But this is an action, so we have an action result. Remove request will be very similar. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to grab all of this top part of add. So we're up to the point that we have a course and a student. And what we'll do is we will ask the schedule repo for selected course sections. And we have get course selectors as a method, but this method takes a student. So what we can use is we can use our stu, which will get us all selected, and that will return to us a collection of course selector items. Then we can say var selector equals all selected, where this will be a course selector item, so csi.course.id equals the course that we've created up here, course.id. So basically this is saying get all the student selections, and then from those selections find the selector that matches by course ID. So now we have the selector, so then we can say stu repo dot, I'm sorry, not stu repo, schedule repo dot remove course request, and then we can pass the selector item to have that removed. And I think what we need is not a where, because a where will return a collection, so we need first or default. And then we can do a quick check and say if the selector is null, we'll throw some sort of a message, else we'll do the remove. So application exception, course not found, on student selector, else we'll remove, and again for now we'll just return a view. So we've kind of now gone through and mocked up most of our work. We have one exception we need to handle, and it probably has to do with not having our interfaces defined. No, that doesn't seem to be the case. It says that we aren't implementing part of an interface. Add course requests. Because we changed it to return the course selector item. So what we need to do is actually update our interface to reflect that change. And this will now return a course selector item. F6, recompile. Alright, so at this point we've now gotten all of our controller pieces set up. We've updated our repositories so that we're getting and setting the appropriate data. And now we can go forward and start to build our views.